I'm Jack Moline. Welcome to State of Belief, continuing coverage of the 2020 Republican National Convention. As soon as Hurricane Laura made landfall in Louisiana's Gulf Coast, a large part of the state lost power, including the city of Monroe, where your host Welton Gaddy was deprived of watching the final day of the convention, as well as talking about it tonight. But I guess I was luckier, as was political management expert Greg Lebel. Greg, thanks again for taking this time with us tonight.
Happy to, Jack. One could argue that maybe Welton was more blessed than we were, considering some of the stuff we saw tonight. But
we'll unpack that a little bit. So, in a convention that was full of religious language, tonight was Franklin Graham's night. How did he do with his 2 minutes?
He did what exactly I think we would expect Franklin Graham to do with his 2 minutes, which was to mix politics and religion quite robustly, thanking God for the last 4 years of the Trump administration and asking God to grant us 4 more. That's pretty unusual for the kinds of benedictions and so forth we're used to at these events. It's just not the way we usually see them. But that's only one example. So.
It does. I mean, it stands in contrast to Cardinal Dolan on the first night of the convention, who was relatively neutral in his words.
Which is not easy for Cardinal Dolan.
Yeah, there you go. It was disturbing to hear former Notre Dame coach Lou Holtz go as far as he did on the third night of the convention,
yes,
smearing Joe Biden's Catholic faith. And today, the university distanced itself from Holtz in his statement, but this kind of attack crosses so many lines, but without real consequences. I'm afraid it's just going to keep happening. What's your opinion on that?
Yeah, it's name calling. That's all that it is, and I think that it's been a hallmark of this administration. It's been a hallmark of this convention. Just ad hominem attacks on people. Without any consideration for what it actually means or if it means anything at all. And I think the Catholic in name only crack is a very good example of that. But there have been many of them, Jack.
So, the Biden campaign released a roster of faith leader endorsements today. Do these endorsements on one side or the other make a difference?
I'm not sure that they do. I have not seen the list, but my guess is there's nobody on there who was really a surprise. And if that's, unless I'm wrong, then it really doesn't mean that much. The only thing that these lists do, I think, in my experience in politics, is if you've got a couple of names on there that are going to surprise people. Oh, so-and-so's there. And whether it's religious leaders or education leaders or leaders in the women's movement or whether it happens to be, it's really the element of a sort of a name that you wouldn't expect to see there. Otherwise, it's just more of the same. It's more of the same.
So Democratic Vice Presidential nominee Kamala Harris tried a counterprogramming move earlier in the day.
Yeah.
Trump does this very well also. Does it work for anyone else who tries it?
It's an interesting question. I've noticed a lot more of that actually on both sides this year during both these conventions, and it's hard to imagine that it really does much matter. I could be wrong. I think we've seen a lot of spots from the opposing candidate in the two debates, which I think probably don't mean that much. The question is always how many people are watching this who are really sort of trying to decide where they want to land, and I'm not sure what those numbers are. I mean, we really don't know what the breakdown of people who are watching these events are. So I think that Kamala Harris's comments were timely and appropriate for other things that are going on in the country, but I'm not sure as it relates to the convention how much it matters.
So you raise an interesting point about persuadables.
Yeah.
Are there really any undecided voters left in this country, or is this just sort of an exercise in shouting at each other?
Well, it's interesting, Jack, because I think this year there appear to be the undecided voters seems to be a little bit larger slice than it's been in the recent past. And I think that's mostly because we have a thin slice on the let's say on the left edge of the Trump supporters who are trying to figure out whether they did the right thing 4 years ago. And I think part of there are a couple of groups there. I think there are folks who were just couldn't bring them, just didn't like Hillary Clinton, and decided that's where they were going to go. And I think the other group of people is folks who were so sure that Hillary Clinton was going to win, and this was an opportunity to send a message without messing things up. But it turns out they did mess things up. So there is that chunk that I think we've seen a lot of play to those folks, probably in both conventions, but certainly in the last 4 days here. I think that the Trump people are a little concerned about what's happening on the edge of their base. So there's some potential for movement there, and both groups are sort of making plays for it, I think.
So it's interesting that you mentioned the people who wanted to send a message within the Democratic Party. The president really laid into Bernie Sanders tonight. I mean, he really laid into him. And if there was any hope of fomenting that dissent within the Democratic Party, it seems to me that he blew it tonight. Is that correct?
I would agree with you. I think he clearly did blow that up tonight, and I think it was ham-handed. But there's a lot of ham-handedness that we watched tonight, certainly through the whole process. But I think it's also the effect of Senator Sanders and Vice President Biden developing a much stronger relationship and partnership since Biden was assured of the nomination that went on 4 years ago. So I think on both sides.
Yeah. Greg, I watched the convention on C-SPAN. I don't know where you watched it. I like to see things unfiltered. But during this convention coverage, there's been a week that has consisted of a lot of real-time fact-checking on the networks and the cable news stations. Is that a responsible choice? Does that bias the coverage?
I think it's appropriate. I honestly think it's appropriate. And I think it's particularly appropriate because we're seeing messages that are being tossed out here this year that are so full of misrepresentations, exaggerations at best, but misrepresentations and outright lies that I think that this has to happen, and it's part of a larger move. I mean, we've seen for a number of years the Truth Squads, and they've been around for a while now, but they've really been picking up energy in the last few years, and I think again it's a reaction to the nature of this this candidate and his administration to just make things up whole cloth. And I think it's an appropriate way to do it. And I've noticed that they do it on the other side. It's just that there's so much more coming out on the Trump side than on the other side, that it maybe looks more imbalanced than it actually is.
I would guess that that's right. So what were the few moments that stood out for you tonight in watching this coverage?
Well, I'll start.
Keep in mind, we don't have a lot of time here. We both have to get some sleep.
Yeah. Two things that I didn't hear. We didn't hear anything. This is not surprising. Neither one of them is surprising. We didn't hear anything about the attempts by Russia and Putin to interfere, or any assurances that we will not stand any messing around in the process by foreign governments. I mean, he did go after. But he mentioned at one point that China wants Biden to be elected, but there was no effort to sort of address that. And again, that's not surprising, but I think it's worth noting that was the case. And the other thing, much more significantly, is when he talked about what's going on now with racial issues in this country, with the death, the shooting of Jacob Blake and the death of George Floyd and so on and so forth, all the way back. There was no effort to reach out to the wounded community. It was all, and we saw this with Mike Pence last night. It was all about law and order. I mean, and really heavy-duty law and order stuff. But once again, they clearly made the decision that that's where they were going to land on this. And these folks were called every name in the book, and there was no real effort to address that issue from a broader and more humane perspective. Again, not surprising, but
in fact, he didn't just ignore it. He really mocked the notion of empathy, and
he did. Yeah, you're right.
He mocked empathy and used, I think, probably the most "I'm rubber, you're glue" kind of criticism when he made that snide remark about Joe Biden hugging and kissing people.
Yes, I thought, really, you want to go there? Yeah, it was, and I agree with you. And it's funny because I'm rubber, you're glue, because I thought of that on more than one occasion. That thought came to mind. Moving back a little bit earlier, Jack, a couple of things that were just, again, examples of just how off the wall this has become. Mitch McConnell told us that if Joe Biden is elected president, they'll be telling us how many hamburgers we can eat.
Do you know where that came from?
No, I have no idea. It was, and I think, and Rudy Giuliani's talking about how the Democrat, as they like to say, administration in New York were releasing rioters so as not to interrupt the rioting. I don't know how you make these statements and think that thinking people who are watching this aren't going to kind of scratch their heads and go, this doesn't make any sense. But there's just a plethora of this stuff.
There seemed to be an emphasis tonight on frightening people into voting for Donald Trump.
Yes.
And so it didn't matter how much of what they said was true, as long as it was alarming.
Yeah.
And,
Which says something about who they're trying to reach out to, I think. That's not how you broaden your base. That's essentially how you secure this base, I think. And so that was, but that's been a hallmark of the evening for sure, from start to finish.
Right. Well, I'm sure there is a lot more we could talk about, Greg, and maybe you will with Welton as the weeks go on and we see how some of this rhetoric unfolds into action. But I thank you for the 8 nights you spent with us over these 2 conventions, unpacking it for our viewers and listeners, and for all that you continue to do for us at Interfaith Alliance, and even in your retirement for the various causes that you've invested yourself in.
Well, it's always a joy, Jack, and it's great to see you.
Thank you. Thank you. Greg Lebel is Professor Emeritus of Political Management at George Washington University and the veteran of several presidential campaigns. Thank you again for being here, Greg. Look for all of our convention coverage with activists and analysts at stateofbelief.com. I'm Jack Moline. Thanks for watching. And Welton, I hope your lights go on.